All right, we got a special presentation. Retired Navy Chief Petty Officer G. Lamar Wilkie has been presenting the Declaration of Independence with commentary for several years. Courthouse. He's doing his presentation this year as part of celebrations for the anniversary of the founding of our document. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome G. Lamar Wilkie.
Wow. Make sure my microphone's turned on here. Happy 250th Independence Day. Yay. And no, it's not 4th of July or July 4th. We don't wish people married December 25th because it's my pet peeve. So good to see so many young people here because I was 1 month short of my 14th birthday when we celebrated America's bicentennial in 1976. And that was a blowout celebration. It really was. Never would have thought then that I'd be doing a presentation on the Declaration these days. But I go to the courthouse every year, and it's a blessing to be invited here to do this for you in celebration of our Semiquincentennial, which is an interesting term. It's literally Latin for half of 500, but my math works. That works for me. And hopefully this will inspire some of you young folks to do something like this in the community you end up in, especially for our tricentennial in 2076. I don't think I'll still be doing this at the ripe young age of 113, so I'm going to let y'all do that. Before I read the Declaration, though, I like to preface it with a little bit of history so you can have a better understanding of why once loyal British citizens would finally say, we've had enough, no more, and threw off the chains of oppression from their own government. And I think that'll help you understand the context of the Declaration. They were called extremists, or conspiracy theorists who distributed misinformation. Many considered them criminals guilty of insurrection and even treason. They were our forefathers, and they founded our nation. We'll go back about 20 years. France and Britain had been at war over colonial territory in the 1750s. France had all the Canadian province territory to the north, and they held everything to the west. And they would often incite the native tribes to terrorize colonists along the frontiers. Couldn't go south because Florida was controlled by Spain. The Gulf Coast was largely alligator-infested wilderness and swamp, and to the east was ocean. So the colonists were really, pretty stuck. But the British victory at the Battle of Quebec in 1759 all but ended conflict in North America. The problem was it had been a very expensive war, and Parliament was looking for a way to pay for it. Since much of the conflict had taken place in the New World, they turned their eyes to the American colonies, hoping to cover some of the expenses of keeping a standing army here, which during a period of peacetime was an increasing point of contention among colonists. It seemed like British troops were here not to defend colonists from any external enemies, but to enforce unpopular and unfair British laws on them. Parliament's solution was the Sugar Act, a bill to replace the old Molasses Act of 1733. Now, colonists had gotten around the old Molasses Act by smuggling in molasses and sugar, which were largely turned into rum. Parliament had a policy called salutary neglect. Since enforcing that tax costs 4 times as much as the tax brought in, they really didn't bother with it. The problem with the new Sugar Act, however, was that while it lowered the tax rate in an effort to make colonists more willing to pay it, it provided a lot more funding for enforcement, making smuggling more difficult. And this was at a time when the colonies were in a post-war economic depression and rum was in high demand. Americans protested the act by simply refusing to buy British luxury goods. That caused British merchants to lose money, a lot of it. And they petitioned Parliament to repeal the Sugar Act, which it did. Well, Parliament tried a different tactic when they passed the Stamp Act, which was a law requiring that a government tax be paid so that a tax stamp could be affixed to various paper products. So a newspaper, a deck of playing cards, a marriage license, a contract, any legal documents required that a tax be paid, so a stamp might be affixed to it before it could be sold or registered. Now, on the surface, there may seem to be very little difference between those two laws, but in fact, they were radically different. You see, the Sugar Act was a tariff. It was designed to regulate international trade and commerce, and it was perfectly legal for Parliament to pass. The Stamp Act, on the other hand, was a direct tax on domestically produced and consumed items. Paying an import tariff on molasses was one thing, but paying a tax just for two people to sign a contract was ludicrous. It was the birthright privilege of every British subject that he cannot be taxed except by the consent of a parliament in which he is represented by persons chosen by the people and who also pay a portion of the taxes they impose on others. American colonists were all British subjects, but they had no representation in Parliament. The outcome? Nobody bought the stamps. Because of public protests and pressure from boycotted British merchants, the Stamp Act was repealed almost as fast as it had gone into effect. In the years that followed, Parliament continued to apply direct revenue duties to the colonies. Protests not only continued, they increased. And on March 5th, 1770, British troops opened fire on protesting colonists, killing 5 in what would forever be known as the Boston Massacre. Realizing that things had gone too far, Parliament removed all duties except for the tea tax. And that was coupled with a new law requiring colonists to buy only tea from British-owned East India Tea Company. That led to protests all along the Atlantic seaboard. Colonists actively resisted allowing British tea to be landed in their ports. In April 1772, patriots openly destroyed British tea that had been brought into New York Harbor. Maryland, New Jersey, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Virginia all have reports of the dumping or burning of East India tea in resistance. Of course, the most famous occurred December 16th, 1773. Known as the Boston Tea Party, colonial patriots in disguise boarded merchant ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. Now, that's easy to visualize, but that was enough to make 18.5 million cups of tea. And can you imagine the caffeine-induced frenzy of those poor fish in Boston Harbor? Man, that had to be a sight all its own right there. The British responded by closing the port of Boston and passing what became known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. These acts allowed for British officials and American colonists to be tried in England for crimes committed here. Many charges against colonists were fabricated so that those charged might be made examples of. British officials and military troops who committed felonies such as rape and murder would go to trial and usually be found not guilty despite overwhelming evidence. Parliament also updated the Quartering Act, allowing British troops to occupy any unused buildings, from barns and storehouses to homes of colonists who were simply traveling and not there. Other colonies started sending food and supplies by wagon to the people of Boston and continued to boycott all British goods. One of the problems, though, was that there was no sense of unity. All these groups in each colony were acting independently of each other. In May 1774, Dr. Benjamin Franklin was called before the Privy Council, which was comprised of the King's cabinet and his closest advisors. Franklin sailed from Philadelphia to England as the sole representative of the 13 colonies to plead the colonies' case. He went in. He was not allowed to sit. He was not allowed to speak. For 2 hours, the Privy Council hurled the most vicious tirade upon him. He was insulted, degraded, accused of treason. He later wrote of the experience, saying, "I walked in an Englishman. I walked out an American." And that September 1774, 55 delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia for 7 weeks as a unified Continental Congress. They agreed to a ban on all British goods and a resolve to draft a petition to the king asking for the repeal of the intolerable acts and the removal of troops from Boston. They declared all acts passed by Parliament since 1763 to be in violation of the rights of British citizens of America. When King George III saw the petition, he sneered, complimented its eloquence, and laid it aside. 2 weeks later, he picked it up, rejected it outright, and ordered Parliament to halt all trade, arrest protesters, and protect British loyalists. Well, Parliament, knowing that some reconciliation might still be possible, instead offered a pardon for any repentant rebels, but not for the likes of Patrick Henry, George Washington, John Hancock, or John or Samuel Adams. Had they been captured, they would have been hanged and then drawn and quartered. And if you don't know what being drawn and quartered is, you might want to look that up. It is a gruesome public display of don't do what they did or you're next. A second Continental Congress was scheduled to convene the following May in 1775. However, April 19th, the shot heard round the world rang out on Lexington Green in Concord, Massachusetts. The British had told colonists to surrender their weapons and munitions. The colonists replied by saying, "Come get them." The British marched in to do just that and got shot instead. So colonies began to arm themselves and prepare for war. Over the following months, the delegates from the 13 various colonies began to think and act as a single unified nation. And when New England militias were adopted into the new Continental Army, other colonies began to send troops, and General George Washington, renowned for his victories in the French and Indian War, was named commander-in-chief. That was a brilliant decision because Washington was very familiar with British military tactics. The next year, Virginia's colonial legislature convened in May 1776, and they passed a resolution instructing Virginia's delegates to the Continental Congress propose that the body declare the United Colonies free and independent of Great Britain. 2 months later, on July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress approved the final version of the Declaration of Independence. John Hancock, president of the Continental Congress, was first to sign the Declaration on August 2nd with a great big signature to make sure the king wouldn't miss it. The last of the 56 delegates to sign the Declaration did so on November 4th. I will now read aloud the Declaration of Independence that birthed the greatest nation on earth. In Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Unalienable meaning we're born with them and no one can take our rights away from us without our first giving them up. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed would dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light or transient causes, and accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, which is a seizure of power without authority to do so, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them to absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny in these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. Now, assent to laws was a policy that no local ordinance, resolution, or law could go into effect until it was approved by the king or one of his personal representatives, a magistrate. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodations of large districts of people unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He's called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He's dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation or execution of laws, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He's endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the condition of new appropriation of lands. He's obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices, for the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He's kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He's affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He's combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by mock trial, for punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, he's talking about Canada here, establishing therein an arbitrary government and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our government, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He's abdicated government here. by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He's plundered our seas, ravaged our coast, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is, at this time, transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, destruction, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation, perfidy being betrayal or treachery. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends or brethren, or fall themselves by their hands. He's excited domestic insurrections among us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our petitions have only been answered by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attention to our British brethren. We've warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We've reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here. We've appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, or goodwill. We've reminded and we've conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They, too, have been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity, or common ancestry. We must, therefore, acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Now here's the rest of the story. After reading the declaration, King George III flew into a rage. He dispatched the entire might of the most powerful military force in human history against a ragtag army of colonial patriots and farmers. The Revolutionary War for our independence lasted 6 years. It was horrific, brutal, and costly in both blood and treasure. But with that firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we won. The 56 signers of the Declaration had pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. That was no idle pledge. 9 signers died of wounds during the war. 5 were captured or imprisoned. The wives and children of many signers were killed, jailed, mistreated, or left penniless. 12 signers' homes were burned to the ground. 17 signers lost everything they owned. Not one signer defected, not one surrendered. They lost their lives, they lost their fortunes. Their honor, like their new nation, remained intact. So let's recommit today to doing our part in fulfilling God's divine providence for America. by repeating what the 56 signatories bravely proclaimed with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. It's written in Psalm 33:12, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people he's chosen as his own inheritance." We must also vote for officials who will legislate from a biblically moral worldview. Check their voting record and their positions on issues. Volunteer. Find ways to be that salt and light in our local community, and be completely resolved to have our families stand strong for time-proven biblical truth in every sphere of culture, from our house to the White House. Thank you for indulging me today and inviting me to take part in your conference. I hope you've enjoyed your time here visiting our church in Semiquincentennial. Hope to see you at the County Courthouse next year at noon. I'll be there on Independence Day, Lord willing. Have a great Independence Day weekend. Enjoy your celebration and fireworks. May God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America.